Hi, welcome to History 2202, U.S. History 2202. This is Professor James Cement. This is week 12, a discussion of liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
What you just saw was one of the best-known public service announcements of all time, the so-called Crying Indian advertisement. It was put out by the Keep America Beautiful Foundation in the early 1970s. This was a non-profit foundation founded in 1953. The Keep America Beautiful Foundation spent its first 15 years or so as a civic organization, getting school groups and others to clean up trash in their neighborhoods and feel-good efforts like that. But rising awareness about environmental catastrophes and concerns about pollution and environmental damage caused by industry that was rising in the late 1960s led the foundation to shift its focus to larger issues of pollution and environmental damage, as in this famous ad featuring Indian actor Iron Eyes Cody from the early 1970s. We'll be discussing the environmental movement, one of the most important political movements of the 1960s. We're going to begin our discussion, however, today talking about the issue of the gay liberation movement and the sort of the history of gay people in the history of Western civilization. We're going to take a look at why homosexuality is seen as unnatural and how that is related to our moral codes, how gay people have been discriminated against in American history, what were the early gay political organizations trying to achieve, and finally, what were the Stonewall riots of 1969 about and why were they so pivotal in the history of gay Americans. And finally, we'll take a look at other various ethnic liberation movements of the late 1960s and early 70s, many of them inspired by the civil rights movement, liberation movements for Latinos, Native Americans, and others, and what were they all about. And finally, we'll take a look at what was the environmental movement all about, what gave it birth, and how it evidenced itself in the late 1960s and early 1970s. We talked about the women's liberation movement in the last two classes, examining the long history of patriarchy, or male social, political, and economic dominance. We discussed how ancient and universal it is, that it is the only social hierarchy based on real biological differences, but how those biological differences were exaggerated and extended into realms for which there really is no biological reality. We looked at the example of how the ancient Greeks, and really much of Western cultural tradition, indicated that women's physiological differences affect their mental capacity to mean that they were incapable of rational thought, that therefore they could not participate in affairs of state, which required this kind of higher thinking. And there are plenty more. Women are biologically subservient and thus not fit for leadership. And again, taking real biological differences and extending and exaggerating them into areas that have no biological reality to them. We also talked about how women's liberation and feminism were a twofold struggle. Yes, like for example, the civil rights movement, feminism has had its public side, fighting economic discrimination, seeking equality before the law, allowing for full participation in the nation's political life. But because the oppression of women could also be intimate, within the home, within marriage, within male-female relationships generally, there was also a personal side to the movement. The personal is political has long been an adage or slogan of the feminist movement. Finally, it is significant just how much change has occurred over the last 50-plus years since the beginning of second-wave feminism in the early 1960s. So let us examine another movement, directly inspired by both the civil rights movement and the women's movement. And this is the gay liberation movement. Now, it does not affect as many people as the women's movement. There are more women than gay people, of course, but it has some interesting parallels and some revealing differences. To start with, some general similarities is just how much it has changed things over the past 50 years, how attitudes towards homosexuals and homosexual relationships have undergone a sea change in those 50 years. From a situation in which homosexual acts were illegal in which homosexuals were viewed as sexual deviants and psychologically diseased, we have, though not entirely, come to accept homosexuality as natural, and we have gone so far in erasing laws that once punished homosexuality to, in recent years, legalizing gay marriage, a step considered unthinkable even 20 years ago. And as noted, the gay liberation movement has involved both a struggle for equality in the public sphere, ending laws against homosexual acts, the end to police harassment, and then laws allowing gays to legally participate in all facets of life, from marriage to adoption to serving in the military. But there's also been a private side to the gay liberation movement, the whole business of coming out of the closet to family and friends. And like the women's movement, the gay liberation movement has involved people with which we are intimately connected to, that is, members of our own families, our workmates, our classmates, our circles of friends. Finally, there's the biological dimension, the whole idea of whether homosexuality has a biological basis, that is, whether it is natural or not. As with the women's movement, I want to begin by going way back. Let's revisit the ancient Greeks, who did so much to establish the ideas by which Western civilization has operated for the last 2,500 years. Like many cultures in the past, the Greeks saw homosexuality as natural. In fact, they encouraged it. It was customary for young Greek men to be initiated into sex by older Greek men. Greek stories and histories talk all the time about men taking male lovers, and there is no hint of condemnation in them. A good way to think about it is with the adage, biology enables, culture forbids. There is, obviously, nothing biologically impossible about homosexual acts. It happens all the time. Men have sex with other men, and women have sex with other women. If something is possible, then it is biologically natural. If something is not natural, if it goes against biology, then it is impossible, and we don't need to pass laws against it. As far as I know, there is no law anywhere against people photosynthesizing like plants, or against running faster than the speed of light, because such a law is not necessary. You literally cannot do these things. They are, quite literally, unnatural. So the prohibitions against homosexuality and general societal condemnation of homosexuality are not really based in nature. In fact, we misuse the word natural and unnatural in relation to homosexuality, and always have in American history, because it helps supports the argument that it is wrong. But, in fact, it is wrong because it went against, or for many still goes against, our moral code. Remember, biology enables and culture forbids. And of course in the West and in the United States, that moral code is derived from a Judeo-Christian tradition. We are taught that God made us a certain way and that our bodies are to be used in a certain way. I don't want to get too graphic here, but our genitals are to be used in a certain way. It is natural. That's how the argument goes. But the uses to which we use the body have changed over time. Take your mouths, for instance. It originally evolved, or God created it, depending on your viewpoint, to take in nutrients and water and oxygen. But as humans, we have come to use it for talking. Okay, maybe that's biological and evolutionary, but how about kissing? The point is we have confused a moral code with what is natural. And of course, we're not even going into the question of whether one is born homosexual or one becomes homosexual through environment, or if it's epigenetic, that is, there's a trigger in our genes that a certain environment will set off or not, so some who have this trait become gay and others do not. The science is still out on this and may always be out on this. And indeed, this is a highly fraught question in the gay community and in our society at large. So through much of American history, homosexuality has been seen as a crime against nature, and it is against this that we can view the gay liberation movement of the past 50 years. As with so much else in the modern era of American history, the story of the gay liberation movement begins with World War II. One of the aspects of homosexuality prior to the liberation movement was a sense of isolation. As you read in the text, Harry Hay, founder of the Mattachine Society, founded right here in Los Angeles in 1951, one of the early gay rights organizations, was that gays were, quote, the one group of disadvantaged people who didn't even think of themselves as a group, end quote. Many lived secret lives, scattered around, surrounded by heterosexual norms and kept from linking up by legal and cultural prohibitions. But World War II brought lots of homosexual but closeted men in the armed forces and women in the defense plants together, where they became familiarized with one another. So where there was the beginnings of their own recognition as a distinct group with certain interests and issues unique to them. And part of what made them distinct as a group was not just their sexual orientation, but the fact that they were discriminated against. Most states had laws that made homosexual acts illegal. through most of American history and certainly into the 1960s and 70s. Cultural values said that homosexuality was either sinful or a sign of being mentally unbalanced. Indeed, it was not until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its lists of mental disorders. During the Cold War of the late 1940s and 1950s, homosexuals came under particular fire. Anti-communist hysteria said that homosexuality undermined American unity in the struggle against communism. That is, it was a degeneracy that was weakening our national will. Homosexuals were purged from government and other organizations, along with communists, from all kinds of different organizations, both in the public and private sector. Indeed, oftentimes it was argued that homosexuality allowed you to be blacklisted by communists and made to do their agenda of subverting and undermining American institutions. So it is for good reason that homosexuals remained in the closet through the 1940s and 1950s, and of course earlier, because it was quite dangerous to come out, both for their careers and even for their lives. The early efforts of gay activists, as in the Mattachine Society, which, as I mentioned before, was founded right here in Los Angeles in 1951, or the Daughters of Bilitis, a lesbian organization founded in San Francisco 4 years later in 1955, was to try and persuade average Americans that homosexuality was normal, that homosexuals were normal, just like average Americans, apart from their sexual orientation, just like everyone else, and so should not be persecuted. But the civil rights movement and then the general cultural rebelliousness of the 1960s changed attitudes. The message became less about trying to fit in and convince others that they were normal than, as with the Black Power movement, that homosexuals should embrace their gayness and demand equality on their own terms, that there was nothing to be ashamed of, and also is to throw off their own psychological shackles and embrace being gay, much like the Black Power movement asked African Americans to embrace the differences they had with white people, to embrace the idea that black people were different and special, and not to try to imitate whites, and to throw off the shackles of what white society had put on them, that they were not as good as whites. Similarly, the gay rights movement tried to push the idea that gay people were just as good as heterosexual people, but had a full right to participate in American society on their own terms as gay Americans. The critical event in the history of the gay movement was the so-called Stonewall riots, or uprising, depending on your point of view. An important part of gay culture in the pre-liberation era, and even today, were meeting places. Because gays were isolated, they sought out places where they could congregate in peace, be together, meet each other, not just for sex, but for camaraderie, a sense of community, and for security. But this last was hard to come by, because police frequently raided such places. Typically, the patrons would accept their lot, allow themselves to be arrested, pay their fines, because there was shame and fear. If it got out that they were there, it could have meant losing their jobs, being disowned by their families. But something happened on the night of June 28th in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn, a gay nightclub situated in New York City's Greenwich Village neighborhood. On that night, when the police raided it, the patrons, instead of just giving in and allowing themselves to be arrested, hiding their heads in shame, the patrons fought back. In fact, Stonewall was actually owned by the mafia. They typically paid off the police to leave them alone, but it didn't always work, and the police sometimes raided the places. Moreover, the mafia oftentimes kept records of who was there, and they blackmailed the richer patrons. It was a source of extortion money. But that night, the patrons fought back against the police. They not only resisted the police, but even used parking meters to bust open the paddy wagons where some patrons were already ready to be hauled off down to police stations. For the next 3 nights, June 28th, June 29th, June 30th, and even July 1st, so 4 nights I should say, they resisted as the police came back again and again to arrest patrons. Stonewall marked a transition from the more staid organizations like the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis of the 1950s to a more radical and militant organization, such as the Gay Liberation Fund. On the 1-year anniversary of Stonewall, gays marched through the streets of New York, beginning the annual celebration, the Gay Pride Parade. The movement soon spread to other cities, and while prejudice remained, it had a remarkable success in both changing attitudes, changing public laws, and also changing attitudes in the private sphere. Despite the tragic setbacks of the AIDS epidemic beginning in the 1980s, this movement, this gay liberation movement, has had a remarkable degree of success in ending legal discrimination and changing attitudes. You can see those changing attitudes and changing laws on this page. If you take a look at these statistics from various polls taken over the years. On the left, you see the question of should homosexual relations among consenting adults be legal. In 1977, only 43% of Americans agreed with that statement. By 2019, fully 83% agreed with that statement. On the second statement, should persons of the same sex be allowed to legally marry? In 2004, just 31% said yes. By 2019, fully 3 out of 5 Americans agreed with that idea. There's also been changes in the law. 2 Supreme Court decisions are critically significant on this score. In 2003, in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, I know it says Sullivan versus Texas, but it's actually Lawrence versus Texas, my error. It declared that the Supreme Court ruled that all state laws against homosexual relations and homosexual sex were unconstitutional. And then, of course, in the 2015, the more recent 2015 decision, Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court declared that all state laws banning marriage between same-sex people were unconstitutional, in other words, legalizing gay marriage throughout the United States. Moving on, there have been many other liberation movements that arose in the 1960s, for which we don't have time to go into full and great detail. There was the Chicano liberation movement in the Southwest, which was heavily tied to labor causes, as led by Cesar Chavez, who used Martin Luther King's nonviolent resistance tactics from the civil rights movement to try to overturn abusive laboring conditions in the farms of California's Central Valley. He appealed to the national conscience. He used marches and fasts to highlight the terrible labor conditions, the near slave-like conditions faced by Mexican-American farm workers in California. There were also organizations that fought for equal rights and an end to police harassment of Latinos in urban areas. There was the Brown Berets among Mexican-American persons in the major cities of the Southwest, including right here in Los Angeles. And of course, there was the Young Lords movement among Puerto Rican persons in cities of the Northeast, particularly New York City. All of these sort of came into existence in the late 1960s, and in the case of the United Farm Workers in the mid-1960s, and all of them were very much inspired by the civil rights movement. There was also the American Indian movement, something we briefly talked a little bit about a number of weeks back when we were talking about the American West in the 19th century, and then we extended the discussion into the American Indian situation in the 20th century. The American Indian movement was fight for more autonomy on reservations, for equal rights under the law outside the reservations, and one of the most memorable actions that the American Indian movement took was to fight for a 2-year seizure of Alcatraz Island, the former prison island in San Francisco Bay, for 2 years, for 18 months, I should say, from late 1969 until early 1971, to show by their seizure that the island itself, and by implication other lands, were originally seized from Native Americans. Each of these movements affected a specific and very well-defined group of Americans facing discrimination, economic inequality, political disenfranchisement, and social prejudice. But an equally powerful movement arose among Americans at large about something that did not face any particular group specifically, but all people, all Americans, and that was the environmental movement. Like the women's movement, and the gay movement to some extent, the environmental movement challenged existing assumptions of the 1950s and of much of American history, that nature was put there for the purposes of exploitation by humanity, that nature was given to us by God to make use of, to exploit, to make wealth out of, that it was inexhaustible. Added to that was another widespread assumption that science was good, that innovation always led to a better life, to progress, that the man-made was inherently better than the natural because it was based on science. We talked about this a few weeks back in regards to foods. In the 1950s, preservatives and artificial ingredients were seen as the products of scientific thinking and methods, and so were an improvement over what nature provided. But the general questioning of assumptions that was so much a part of the liberation movements of the 1960s also called into question this idea of relentless progress through science. And so the modern environmental movement was born. There had been earlier ones in progressive era about conserving resources, but the one that emerged in the 1960s was different. It questioned the very idea of progress and growth. And in these pictures, of course, you sort of see the celebrations of things like DDT and modern detergents that do so much damage to the environment. There was this idea that they were just sort of widely accepted and to be celebrated. And like the women's movement and like second wave feminism, the environmental movement of the 1960s was given birth by a book written by a woman in the early 1960s. In this case, the book was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Carson was a marine biologist and a very gifted writer. She'd won the National Book Award, writing about all things about the seas and oceans. It was a celebratory book that did not deal with the question of humanity's impact on the natural world. It was more about the wonders of the natural world, and like nature shows often are on television. But she too was nagged by a problem the same way that Betty Friedan was, that few people were addressing. To her, it was quite evident in her studies of the natural world that something was going seriously wrong. Wildlife was dying in inexplicable ways, and so she, relying on the work of many scientists working in relative obscurity, early ecological and environmental scientists, began to examine the impact of pesticides on wildlife, particularly birds. Scientific progress, part of that institutional authority that was so widely accepted by Americans in the 1950s, was a given to Americans at that time, as science brought progress. But in her book, she focused on how pesticides, and in particular DDT, which was considered a godsend because it killed so many different kinds of insects and had eradicated mosquitoes and other pests, was actually killing off birds and other wildlife. The book became a huge bestseller and helped to launch the environmental movement. Then came a series of environmental catastrophes in the 1960s that captured the attention of Americans through all kinds of TV broadcasts and on the news and in magazines and newspapers. And it brought home to many Americans that Americans' industrial activity, once seen as an unalloyed good, something that led to progress and better living conditions and all kinds of things, had enormous environmental consequences. The two most significant and widely covered of these environmental catastrophes, the first, seen on the left, was the Cuyahoga River fire, when a polluted waterway in Cleveland, Ohio actually caught fire, a river on fire, and it shocked many Americans. The second was, as you can see on the right, was a massive offshore oil spill in Santa Barbara that covered some of the most beautiful coastline in America with a thick layer of oil. The picture of dying seabirds and sea mammals shocked Americans from coast to coast. So the book Silent Spring and these environmental catastrophes helped launch the modern environmental movement. This was not just conservation, as in Teddy Roosevelt, stay back at the turn of the 20th century, even John Muir's loving nature for its own sake. The environmental movement in Silent Spring, as initiated by Silent Spring, was an expose of the dangers of progress itself, of science gone amok. The environmental movement began to question the precepts of modern science. In fact, it was also about questioning those institutions we talked about a couple of weeks ago when discussing the 1950s, the big institutions that brought the good life, in this case, big science. Carson began the dialogue, still with us, that ordinary people could question what authorities and experts in big institutions told us was good, that we should be directed not by others, listening to authorities, but question what they said, to be inner-directed, to challenge things, to think for ourselves. And of course, the environmental movement has become one of the most important political movements of our time, especially as we face the existential crisis of climate change. And that concludes this brief discussion of the various liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s, beginning with the women's movement, through the various ethnic movements, the gay liberation movement, and finally the environmental movement. The 1960s and 1970s were a time of revolutionary change in America, particularly in getting Americans to question the existing way of things. And in doing so, these various liberation movements shifted the paradigm, the existing way of looking at things, on so much that was part of American life. How Americans dealt with race, with gender, with sexual orientation, with ethnicity, and even with how humanity should interact with its environment. But if there's one truism in human history, it is that every revolution that brings change has its costs. That some always feel that they are losing out by the gains that are made by others or made in other facets of life, even if that loss is merely a matter of losing certainties about the way things ought to be. And that sense of loss and of disorienting change almost always produces a reaction, a counter-revolution to the revolution. And that will be the subject for next week, the conservative reaction to all of the changes America was undergoing in the 1960s and 70s. Thanks for tuning in.